Fix the Grid has been developing a strategy for how to use our collective efforts most effectively. And the purpose of a strategy is to focus our energy in a way that's going to produce the most impact, you know? So if you have a big boulder and you want to move that boulder, think of the ISO as a big boulder, and you want to move that boulder, if we're all leaning in the same direction, if we put the bar into that boulder in one spot, that's the pivot spot, and we all lean on it, we can move that boulder. So that's the purpose of a strategy, is to focus our collective effort to make a change. So how do you approach developing a strategy? First, you want to know, what do you want to accomplish? And then you want to know who's got the power to make the changes that you want to see happen. What people has the power? What institutions has the power? Well, we looked at this grid issue and we said, who's got the power? And everything pointed to ISO has the power. So then we have to figure out what's going to motivate the ISO to make those changes. And then finally, backing up, how do we mobilize the community to push on those forces to make those changes? So that's the theory behind developing a strategy. What do you want to accomplish? What are the outcomes? Who has the power to make this happen? Who's the targets? What are the institutions? What people? And then what forces can we use to motivate those people? And then how do we mobilize to direct our energy towards those forces? So let's just look at where we came to as Fix the Grid in terms of the strategy.
All right, so kind of the first thing is just thinking about what are we trying to get on a broader level. And there, we're wanting a rapid transition. We want a just, distributed, renewable, and resilient New England grid. We want to keep the lights on with low emissions and distributed. Our second just kind of principle here is that changes in ISO New England's governance can play a central role in that grid transition or in fighting it. So third, we have to recognize that state governments have the power and a unique position to leverage changes at ISO New England. So using our elected officials to get the kind of changes that we want at the grid operator. And finally, by organizing ourselves, we are consumers, we are ratepayers, we live in these, communities with power plants in them, we can motivate state leadership to take action.
So we're going to break down a little bit that when we talk about what electric grid we're trying to build, we use a lot of buzzwords and we try to be consistent with which words we use. But just to be clear about what we mean when we say these words, we want an electric grid that is just, which means that it protects marginalized communities from economic and environmental impacts. We want to recognize that some communities have been disproportionately impacted by our fossil fuel system, and the grid of the future needs to not replicate those harms and needs to repair and compensate for those harms. We want a grid that is resilient, that is able to adapt to the effects of climate change, and that is not as susceptible to blackouts or to, if one power line goes down, that people have power, especially the more local and distributed you make a system, the more resilient it is to potential problems. We want it to be renewable, to have energy that comes from renewable sources, as well as storage and and then we want it to be transparent. So that means that the planning and decision-making processes that impact the grid are visible and accessible to everyone, that people can show up at public meetings and ask questions and know what's happening and understand what's happening and have their voice be heard in that process. And then lastly, that it's distributed. So it builds on community-based generation, conservation, and distribution of energy. We talked a little bit about this in the energy democracy panel, to have lots of little hubs of generation, of energy saving, demand response types of things, makes a grid much more able to adapt to different situations. So in moving towards this ultimate goal of a rapid transition to a just, distributed, renewable, resilient, transparent grid, we are focusing on engaging officials from New England states. So it's going to require governance change from ISO New England and NEPOOL. Hopefully y'all are very familiar with these acronyms by now. And state governments are the ones who have the influence to push ISO New England and NEPOOL to make these changes. They have more of a platform than we do, so we need our state leaders to step up. And that means we need to tell them what we want from them. We need to make it clear to our state leaders that their constituents, their ratepayers of the region, need these changes in public participation, environmental justice expertise, transparency, etc.
We've been pursuing this strategy for the last bit of time, and we've made some accomplishments, and this summit is now getting us ready to launch the next step in this strategy. The accomplishments are that we've learned a tremendous amount about ISO. A few years ago, I didn't even know that there was such a thing as an ISO. And I'm not alone in that. A lot of us have been in a crash course about what is this phenomenon that is a regional grid manager, and how does it work, and who are the bodies around ISO that influence it. We decided to narrow our focus, and because there's a lot of things we could be complaining about ISO about, and a lot of changes we could make, we decided that we were going to focus our efforts on the issue of governance at ISO. Who's in charge, and how do decisions get made? And because we believed that if we could change the governance, then a lot of things were going to change as a result. And we started to show up at ISO meetings, both inside those meetings and outside those meetings. We started to say, we are here, we have a voice. We would stand up at meetings and speak at those meetings and demand that ISO pay attention to us. And in fact, they started to create space for us to have a voice. 2 years ago, ISO board meetings were closed. There was no public access to the board. And now, one of their meetings every year is public. And we show up, and we're speaking at those meetings. A few years ago, the Consumer Liaison Group, which is the ISO body that is supposed to represent consumers, was filled out by industry insiders who, with maybe a couple of exceptions, Don, who kind of followed the ISO program, and ISO came to those meetings and simply did their report on here's what we're doing, and everybody was, polite and clapped, and that was it. Well, now the Consumer Liaison Group, which is led by a coordinating committee, has more than half of that coordinating committee being environmental justice activists, Regine, Nathan, and others, who we elected because we showed up at those meetings en masse, and we voted in a slate of members of that coordinating committee, and that coordinating committee is now leveraging ISO in ways that it couldn't do before. So we are showing up, and now we're going, so what other leverage can we have? We're establishing ourselves as a credible voice, as a collective voice. What other leverage can we have that is going to push the ISO? And we're focusing on governance, and we're focusing on the role of the states in influencing the governance at ISO. Because what we've learned is that the states in New England have a history of communicating their displeasure about ISO governance to ISO. Over the last few years, the states have sent letters to ISO from the senators, from the governors, that says we're not happy about how you're doing governance here. We want more representation from the states. So we said, aha, this is a leverage point, because the states are already on the case. If we get behind those states and say, more changes, we support you, we want to work together with you in making these changes, then we're going to have some leverage that we can use to make these changes at ISO.
And so we developed a list of demands that we think will go a long way, at least, in creating this grid that we want and that we need. And I want to be clear that these demands are the result of lots of conversations with lots of people. When we say we mean the Fix the Grid campaign, which includes a lot of different organizations and community leaders and stakeholders of various kinds, because we want the demands to reflect the needs of communities. And so we landed on these 6 demands this past fall, and I'm going to have Ada at least start walking through.
Yeah, so here are some of our demands. And I would also the only last thing I'd add is that, these are demands that we have workshopped and identified and are now, kind of convincing folks on. And they're also demands that we are continually thinking about and refining and making stronger. All right, so first is the environmental justice team at ISO New England. This is something that we've already made some progress on. You might have heard that there is currently a job posting up for an environmental justice position at ISO New England. That's a step. As all of us in this room know, one person in one job can only do so much. So we want the whole team. And we don't just want it to be, a tokenized role. We want this team to be really looking at substantive things. So how can we look at the social costs and benefits that the grid has? Does this team actually have the authority to influence decisions? And how are they maintaining community relationships? So they're facilitating, not just what they think environmental justice is, but actually incorporating the community. So the next one is state representation on ISO New England's board. As we've conceived of it, we have not just one state like some ISOs, we are a whole region. And so each of those states should be represented on the board of directors. If you don't know that much about the board of directors right now, it is a group that essentially self-reconfirms its new members. So if you look at who all's been on the board, it's a lot of people with very similar backgrounds, and we don't think that makes a lot of sense.
Thanks, Ada. We also want to increase regional public participation. So we've talked a lot about the consumer liaison group meeting, a lot about the consumer liaison group today and their meetings and how that space has evolved. And ISO New England needs to continue to empower that space to be a venue for ratepayers to engage in meaningful two-way conversation, not just for ISO New England to say, here's the latest we've done, here's some slides, but to actually solicit input and take into account that input. And we also want other channels and other opportunities for those who wish to access and participate in ISO proceedings to be able to ask questions, to show up at board meetings and hear what's going on and be part of that process. And then the last one that's directly related to ISO New England is for them to update their mission statement to include language related to a rapid and just transition to renewable energy, as well as having clear, strong benchmarks for decarbonization and greenhouse gas reduction that align with state legislative goals. 5 of our 6 states in the region have strong binding climate legislation, and our grid operator is out of step with them. The last two demands relate to NEPOOL. So NEPOOL is the New England Power Pool, or the stakeholder body of ISO. And despite being the stakeholder process, their meetings are all closed to the public. And so one of the big things is to open those meetings up to the public and to widely accessible media outlets. Right now, there is one outlet that can attend NEPOOL meetings, and the subscription for that outlet is literally hundreds of dollars a year. And so we want that information to be accessible to ratepayers. And then the last piece is to redistribute voting power within NEPOOL. There are currently 6 voting blocks, and it's a system that really benefits incumbent power structures. So utilities and transmission companies and generation companies, they have a lot more power than environmental organizations, public interest advocates, anyone representing the public and kind of the average ratepayers. So we want to reorganize how the voting system happens in NEPOOL and give more power to governors, attorneys general, the Consumer Liaison Group coordinating committee members, and also allocate more voting power to groups representing ratepayers, the environment, and the public interest. So those are our 6 demands. And now we're going to talk more about our action plan. So we started in January, after drafting our demands last fall. In late 2023 and then heading into January, we started meeting with officials from the 6 states in our region. And we met with NESCO managers, so the New England States Committee on Electricity, meeting with those folks, public utilities commissioners, and other state agency heads to get their individual thoughts on our demands, to kind of see what was most exciting to them, what they saw the most potential in, what they maybe had the most hesitations about. We also met with some federal officials from the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, from U.S. senators' offices, and we power mapped the states. Based on the feedback we got, we kind of mapped out who is really excited about a lot of this stuff, who is excited about maybe some of it, but not all of it, who is really not really with us, and now we have a better sense of where the 6 states land. So our next step is to draft a letter outlining our demands to ISO New England and have the states, hopefully a lot of them, sign on to it and say, you know, basically have this letter come from the states. We'll just be writing it for them, but have them tell ISO, this is what we expect from you because we have these climate goals, we have these needs for our communities, and you are standing in the way. So here's what we need you to do differently. And so circulate that letter among the public utilities commissioners, among all these players, and have them sign on. And then as we're gathering sign-ons, we want to plan various actions and events in the 6 states to show our state leaders, this is what we want from you. We're standing behind you. We need you to step up and be leaders to try to boost the number of sign-ons that we get throughout the summer and eventually build towards delivering this letter to ISO New England in late summer. So that's what we're looking at in terms of the next 6 months or so of specific tactics. And there are some other pieces that are happening in parallel to this, like the quarterly Consumer Liaison Group meetings and other regional events. And we have information about those meetings in an action guide that is linked to in the QR code on the back of your agenda sheet. Which Stephen, I think, is also going to walk folks through the action guide in one of our breakout groups. But there's a QR code on the back of your agenda, and there's a link in there to all kinds of meetings coming up where you can talk to your public officials and let them know what you want from them and how much you support these changes to governance of our grid.
So this is where we all come into the action, because the next stage is going to be about people from the states going to our representatives who are supposed to represent us and telling them that we really want them to continue to push ISO for these changes. And that's the campaign going forward, is going to be mobilizing people in our communities to do some very simple things. And the action guide is going to help point you in that direction.
So we're going to build on that. You know, we've done a lot of really great work, and we have more work to do.